we will get started. I know there'll be a few people still coming in, but thank you all very much for joining this morning. I'm Sherry Hughes, the UK Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Director for PageGroup, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm a straight ally. I suppose, how can the workplace be a better ally to the LGBTQIA+ community? And that's what we're talking about today. And I always kind of find it a little bit of a conversation which is like, are we still talking about this? No, hasn't society moved on yet? Haven't we all got it? And sadly, we haven't. So just by way of a little bit of an introduction, I think to be clear on what an ally is it's someone from a non-marginalised group who uses their privilege to advocate for a marginalised group. And I'd like to think that we all sit here saying, yes, I'm an ally, and it's homophobia is inappropriate and shouldn't happen and should be stamped out. But there is a huge difference between levels of allyship. There is performative allyship, which is kind of a bit of bandwagoning, and actually you're out for yourself really more than the person, and feeling like you should do it because everyone else is doing it, a bit of bandwagoning. And then there is real authentic allyship, and that's what we're going to talk about today. How can actually we all be more empathetic? How can we make sure that we sit in the discomfort? How can we do more about making changes? And I suppose it's about our vulnerability as well, and how do we learn from our mistakes and do more to hold ourselves accountable and make the world a better place for all marginalised groups. And I think we need to remember that it doesn't stop with one characteristic either. The more marginalised identities somebody has, actually the more their barriers are in not just the workplace but society as well. And I just want to share a couple of stats, because we will talk about intersectionality today as well, and how do we treat the whole person in front of us and not just label them by individual characteristics, because by nature we are all more than our characteristics anyway. I'm not just a woman and a mother, I'm also a friend, and I work really hard, and I'm a daughter. And it's like, why do we feel the need to label it? But I just wanted to share a couple of stats today. So if you think about LGBTQ+ communities anyway, 12% of people who are Black, Asian and minority ethnic, as well as being LGBTQ+, have lost their job because of being LGBTQ+, versus only 3% of white LGBTQ+ employees. And that's a Stonewall report. 52% of women have experienced bullying and harassment, and this is a Business in the Community survey. But for these women, it was even higher if they had more diverse characteristics. So actually, once you put a gay woman, it was 54%. It went up again if it was a bisexual woman, 61%. And then Black women was 69%, and disabled women was 71%. And so, I'm delighted to have a wonderful panel here with me today, and who are going to really get into the nitty-gritty of some of these topics and see how we can all do a bit better. So if you could all turn your cameras on, please, and I'll welcome you all to the session. I've got Jules from Citi, I've got Ben from Clarion, I've got Tolu from Deloitte, I've got Sean. I'm going to need the slide cam. I was doing so well remembering it all, and then actually I'm going to need a prompt from the slide as to where that's it. From Flair, I knew I was there somewhere. And then Saskia, who is an LGBTQ+ inclusion and diversity consultant. So let's hear from all of you lovely people a little bit more about who you are. Jules, you're next on my screen, so if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Jules. I'm a quantitative analyst for Citi, and I'm also the trans rep for Citi Pride and Out in Markets, which is specifically the LGBT+ markets at Citi. And I use they them pronouns because I'm non-binary. So yeah, do you want to go ahead, Ben?
Well, morning everybody. My name's Ben Rainforth. I'm the Director of People and Organisational Development at Clarion. So within that wonderful eclectic remit that I look after is equity, diversity and inclusion, which is certainly has always been a core passion of mine, and around wanting to champion and make that an difference. My pronouns are he and him.
Thanks, Ben. Tolu?
Hi everyone, glad to be here today. So my name is Tolu Osanubi. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior manager at Deloitte UK. Day to day, I am heavily involved in managing test teams who work on large digital transformation programs, but I'm also really passionate about diversity and inclusion. And I sit on our LGBTQ+ network Proud at Deloitte's leadership team, where I'm very much focused on driving our intersectionality initiatives and collaborations with other networks. But outside of work, I'm also a dog mom. I have a Chihuahua who is gorgeous and have a partner of 7 years. So lovely to be here today.
Thanks, Tolu. Maybe we get a shot of the Chihuahua in a bit if they pop up and say hi. Sean.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Sean Adams Po-Kin-Ek. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a out and proud gay Chinese man. I manage legal and financial relations at Flair, which is a racial equity technology company. I moved to the UK in 2021 from Singapore, where I grew up and spent the last 30 years of my life in, previously working at Bloomberg, where I was also a co-chair for Be Proud Singapore, which is Bloomberg's LGBTQ+ pillar. I now reside in Derbyshire with my husband, who I've been together with for 12 years, married for 7. And I spend most, if not all of my free time gardening, taking strolls in the countryside with my also 4-legged companion, Ashley.
Bring on the dogs. That's it. Thanks, Sean. Saskia, hi.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. So my name's Saskia. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an LGBTQ+ inclusion and diversity consultant in schools and the workplace. I'm also a Pride host and a podcast and radio interviewer. And I am a mum as well, proud mum. And basically all the work that I do is really about thinking how can I positively spotlight the LGBTQ+ community. So again, through all those different strands, how can we make inclusive and safe spaces so that everyone can be their true authentic self?
Yeah, well said. Thanks, Saskia. Well, welcome to all of you. Delighted to have you here. So this will be a webinar which I'm sure you're all more than familiar with these days. So please do pop any questions you've got in the chat, or even just comments if you want to show some support for perhaps what any of the panel is saying. Then please do, let's hear from you, because we want to try and get to your questions as well, because you've taken the time to join. So if there are things you want to know, then please do ask away. So we're just going to kind of build the scene a little bit here and kind of get a bit of a backdrop as to where we are. So maybe you could talk about how things have changed for the LGBTQ+ community in the workplace, perhaps over the last 2 years with the pandemic and so on. So Sean, I'm going to start with you, please.
Okay, well, I think definitely representation has very much increased, and we're seeing sort of individuals feeling comfortable about being themselves. And I think going back to when sexual orientation became a focus in the workplace, a lot of the conversations were around being able to come out and being accepted in the workplace. But I think today, the narrative has very much shifted beyond that to look at sort of dispelling stereotypes that might lead specifically to barriers to success and career progression. And I think a lot of this sort of came partly because of Tim Cook, who came out as the first Fortune 500 company CEO as a gay man. And I think it's allowed a lot of sort of people from different sexual orientations to sort of build career aspirations without being hindered specifically by their sexual orientation. And I think in Singapore, where homosexuality is still very much criminalized, and whilst I was out and proud, but I've always sort of bothered on being a bit more on the effeminate side. I actually had a manager who once messaged me on the site saying, I need to be more sort of formal and serious to have gravitas. But weirdly enough, my other colleagues, managers, and more junior employees enjoyed being around sort of my authentic self. And had the results to show that I was performing and also was a role model for many. So I think there's still this popular belief out there that while you have to be some type of formal and professional, that just because you're out and proud and sort of wear brighter clothing, and as a gay man sort of wearing makeup, that it diminishes your professionalism in the place and in front of clients. But that, I think, has so little truth to it, and I think that it's still very much sort of breaking down barriers about being themselves in a workplace because of traditional definitions of what professionalism looks like. So it's about sort of breaking down those barriers around sort of career progression.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Saskia, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, kind of echoing really what Sean said. I think it's always important not to be complacent in where we are within society, obviously, and even in the world with LGBTQ+ inclusion. A recent, for Stonewall, I don't know if you've seen that, but their recent Take Pride report showed that overall, in terms of public opinion, there has been a positive increase. Overall public opinion is that there is more respect for the LGBTQ plus community. But then when we bring it back into the workplace, we still know that, you know, there is a large proportion of our community that maybe don't feel safe in being able to be open and out, that have been discriminated against. They are feeling like, you know, there still is a long way to go in terms of creating those safe spaces, you know, even from that perspective of psychological safety, you know, as a trans person, as a lesbian, or as a bi person, can I speak up and can I, you know, give my opinion, or is it safe for me to do that? So, you know, there is definitely a positive increase, but I think we still absolutely need more compulsory LGBTQ plus, you know, inclusion training. We still need to keep those conversations going. We still need people to feel that actually this is an opportunity for me. You know, if my workplace isn't showing me, you know, that it's an inclusive space, I have the right to say that actually I would like this, and having that confidence around that, you know, and people feeling that they can say that. So yes, in many ways we are seeing a positive change, but there's still, you know, again, a lot to do, which I'm so bored of saying, but that's where we're at. There is still always so, but as you mentioned earlier, you know, a way to go, but it is what it is. It's just about, I think, having that confidence for people to know that actually you do have your rights, and, you know, voice them where you can. And I know we'll talk more on that, you know, throughout the session.
I know what you mean. There's days where you go, progress isn't quick enough, and then other days you go, do you know what, actually we need to remember we're really moving in the right direction. You gave me a nice reminder that I forgot to do the poll, but actually it's quite a relevant timing because you talked about training there anyway, Saskia. So let's load a quick poll and let's see what the audience are experiencing when it comes quite specifically to allyship training, because clearly that's the premise of today. So if everyone could just do a quick poll for me. So have you completed any allyship training? Yes, it's mandatory at your employer. Yes, you did. It was optional. No, although it has been offered, you didn't take it. And then no, you've never had the opportunity, or non-applicable for anything else that I wasn't quite sure about. So yeah, we'll just take a couple of moments because we're then going to talk about allyship. So it'd be interesting to see kind of what the experience is out there in the working world. Just give you a moment to do that. I could have hold music or something like that, or, you know, something riveting. We got scores for that just yet? There we go. Oh, crikey.
Oh, wow.
My goodness, I did not expect that. I really thought more people would have had it offered to them. That is, well, never has it been more appropriate that we're doing a webinar on this then, people, I think. Crikey. Any of the panel want to share a view on that? Jules, what do you think to that result?
I mean, I honestly thought that it was optional in more places, at least, because I know that's something that's been offered at City optionally. I don't think it's mandatory, maybe for managers, but not for non-managers at least. But it's definitely been offered, and I've taken it personally. I think maybe it's something that may exist in your company, but it's not advertised well. I think that's an issue that exists a lot, in that a lot of companies have a lot of resources, but they don't advertise them very well. So if you are part of the people who are saying that, you know, you had never been offered, maybe reach out to like HR or, you know, any Pride network or, you know, associations or clubs, whatever that exist in your company, to try and hopefully get that training if you would like it.
Yeah, great. So what is it about the role of the ally that makes such a difference then, Tolu? What is it for you?
I think something I did also want to quickly jump in on the previous question before I go into this is when we did go through the pandemic, for a lot of LGBTQ plus people, they found themselves in a really challenging position of going back into the closet, because people were either having to maybe go back home or be in spaces maybe with housemates, or where they didn't feel free to be themselves or be authentic. So I think that there's also been, over the last couple of years, for a lot of LGBTQ plus people, the time where they've had to maybe go back in and not be able to be their authentic selves. And I guess as we're coming out of the pandemic, in quotes, coming out, we're still very much, I guess, in it. but people are getting an opportunity to rediscover their community, reconnect with people, maybe go out to events and things like that. And also in the context of the workplace as well, LGBTQ plus networks, you know, doing social events and things like that again, and connecting as a community. But to move on to the question around the role of an ally and what makes such a difference, I think for me, allyship has been such a buzzword and something that's been said over and over again in many guises over the last couple of years. And I think it can be quite frustrating when it gets reduced to whether it's, I don't know, a rainbow logo for an organisation for the course of June, or in 2020 it was a black square and posting that, and no real meaningful action behind it. And I think a definition that's really resonated with me is an ally being described as someone's success partner. And that means that it's something that where someone's taking a really active investment and looking how they create, maybe it's active opportunities or advocating for someone. And I think where an ally really makes such a difference is you talked a lot at the start about privilege, but behind that privilege is you have some sort of influence. It's kind of understanding and acknowledging those situations where you do have influence, to use that to help marginalized voices and give them a platform to tell their stories, like we're doing right now, for example, or having the awareness to understand your privilege to say, actually, I don't need to say anything in this point in time, or this is an opportunity for me to speak out and help. And I think the real second thing for me that is around making sure that it's long-term and continuous sustained action, because I think a lot of times people are very quick to do something, like if it's a, I don't know, a rainbow logo or lanyard, to use the same thing again. But as soon as we get out of, so today is the 28th of June, so when it gets to the 1st of July, I'm sure all the logos are going to go back and we move on to something else. But how do we keep that kind of sustained action all year round? How do we make sure we're celebrating, so whether queer culture or our queer colleagues, so they feel included all year round? But also, how do we make sure that we aren't just we are creating spaces where people feel that they can be themselves, be authentic, as Sean described as well, because I think those are really important things in terms of that allyship piece.
I think that's really well said. Have you heard the similar thing, Ben, over in Clarion, or what's your experience about this consistency and it all being all a big glitter ball and rainbows for a month and then not a lot?
Yeah, I think it's tokenism, isn't it? I mean, as organisations, we like to put things up because it's a nice, shiny thing that we do. I think the longevity is around the genuineness, both from an employer's perspective, but also from a societal perspective as well. I probably wasn't surprised with the poll, if I touch on that, because from a director of learning and organisational development, I think at times we swamp organisations with a whole myriad of training and education. And for me, it's about just drawing it back to the genuine authenticness of what we're trying to do with that inclusive banner wrapped around it, and also it being real, and making it tangible. Touching on allyship, I think for me, in my experience, both as an openly gay man and in a leadership role, and equally being in an influencing role for a large organisation, it's about genuineness. It's about that journey of the creation of psychological safety within an organisation that we all talk to and we all talk about, but we need to understand that in depth. It's the active supporting, not only in the workplace, but from a societal perspective as well. And then when we talk about privilege and just having that open conversation around looking around who we socialise with on a personal perspective, both inside and outside of work, and just checking that in. And equally for me, it's around that 360 of feedback. So, you know, from a community perspective, everybody sort of has the association that it's Pride Month and we just all go and have a merry old time on a Pride float. But actually, we need to be educating not only our own community, but the wider community around the indifference and the battle that we've all been through, and use it as an educational reset and for really influencing people. So for me, it's around wrapping those arms around not only just the stock standard HR mandatory training course that we do, but equally how we support our network groups within an organisation, the channels that we have from a Wellbeing Matters perspective through our health and safety orientation, and actually just try being on the journey of normalising that this is us, we're all unique, we're all different, but actually we really want to celebrate and champion where we see allyship really working for either an individual or a collective of individuals in an organisation.
And when you talk about psychological safety, it's about everybody being seen, heard and understood. And if we just start there, I mean, yeah, you're kind of on a solid path really to giving everybody real purpose. So what about maybe some specific experiences where perhaps you have had someone be really active in their allyship to you? So something that was really authentic and someone went over and above. Sean, have you got something you want to talk about there?
Yes, actually, what I'm about to share really resonates very much with what sort of Ben shared earlier with regards to what an ally is. And I think this is especially close to my heart because at the start of my career, my first job out of university was in Bloomberg. And there was this sort of straight white man who was the head of department there. Excuse me. And at that time, the BPROC community in Singapore was very small. And, you know, being a fresh graduate, I didn't want to sort of rock the boat and decided to just conform to being a mainstream, sort of very formal, straight sort of Chinese man in the workplace. And I buried many of my characteristics in what I perceived as acceptable within a professional setting. But what was interesting was that during a one-to-one setting, this head of department asked me that he occasionally noticed that during social settings, I let slip nuances of another personality that was vastly different from who I was at work. And what he helped was, he asked if I was comfortable being at work. And at the same time, the question came in the pretext that he wanted to really know my background, where I came from, where I was in life. And I think this forms the base of being an ally, which is that firstly, the personal aspect. And the second aspect goes back to what Ben mentioned about, which is sort of providing me with the opportunities and platforms to come out of my shell. And I think the key word here is step by step, right? And what this looked like for me was, this started out at informal department huddles versus sort of like huge office-wide events where he got me to share more about Pink Dot, which was Singapore's Pride equivalent, and to encourage people to join Pink Dot and gradually share my coming out story, which at the time took a great deal of courage. I could remember myself just breaking down in front of so many people. But what I received after that were sort of loads of hugs, encouragement, celebration, and especially in a society where, you know, it's still criminalized, was so empowering, and that had such a profound effect throughout my career and allowed me to be confident in my own skin and celebrating myself. So I think an allyship to me, I think it's really sort of starting on a personal level to let it be that person be comfortable with you and broadening that comfort level through your network, where I think you are able to put yourself next to your LGBTQ colleague to celebrate the identities in front of your network. And to me, I think that's a sort of prime epitome of what allyship is.
And therefore, has it been easier for you from that moment on, being yourself?
Yes,
you still have to come out all the time, don't you? You know,
I mean, even to today, that is literally the building block of who I am today in the workplace, and that has helped me so much. In fact, I just met him in London a while back, and I think that's when, because I've never really took the chance to thank him, and I think we don't say thank you enough, really. And I think when I shared that with him, you know, he never knew that sort of what he did had such a profound effect in me growing up as a gay man in society and also within the workplace itself.
Well, thank you. I'm going to make sure I thank you all now for sharing that. Thank you. Ben, how can people be a better ally to you? What's your personal take on this rather than the business, Ben?
Oh, I think this is such a great question, and we could go down so many different rabbit holes in relation to it. I suppose me and my brain and how it works is rolling things back to the simplicity of what we're trying to achieve. And it comes back to a genuine want. And I think some of that's driven by the inert human within. So for me, it's around a confidence. So somebody that you can share that's actively willing to open and listen and provide feedback in a non-subjective or judgmental way. I think privilege comes in hugely, and having worked globally, I think some of my personal shock and awe with coming back to the UK demographic was just around the fundamental different layers of privilege and how that really impacts people right across from a societal perspective. For me, don't assume. I think, you know, sharing a personal story, I'm quite jovial. I'm, you know, full of life, full of energy. And I think at times people can take that for granted, thinking that you're A-OK all the time. So not having that assumption, and people can sort of pick you up that maybe you're not yourself during the day, that they're open and they're inquisitive in some of that questions. And then the other lens I put on it is from a business perspective, and that's primarily because of the role that I work in, and it's about being authentic and genuine. I think in organisations, when we talk a lot about equality, well, we have to comply with equality. It is law, it is legislation, we need to do it. So what we need to be focusing and turning the dial on is looking at equity and inclusion and making it real. And we get that through the creation of psychological safety, through allyship, through enrolling our people into wanting to be open and ask questions without being judged or predetermined in a negative way that's going to springboard into some discrimination case. And just really want to encouraging people to sort of share their journeys and what they're going through. And I suppose I will also share a personal insight into allyship. So I've tended to bend off the corporate attire, the corporate suit that you're supposed to wear as a bloke in business. And I've done that over the last probably 5 or 6 years because it's me. I dress professionally, I wish to be who I am, but uniquely, I want to be the individual person that I am. And that sometimes is a bit of Marmite. So the week before last, I was down at our head office, we were presenting our annual awards, and I was lucky enough to present our Diversity Champion Impact Award. And one of our senior executives turned around to me because I was wearing a shirt and I had this jacket on, but it was too hot in the office, so I had to spin it off. And I said, oh, you know, is this a bit loud or whatever else? And he said, you know what, that's just you. And you should be proud of just being you, because that's what makes you unique. And that's allyship in the moment. And I suppose it's not forgetting those in the moment pieces, because it's about building a continuum momentum and stop trying to focus on utopia that we might necessarily never get to, but we've got to celebrate those quick wins, and we've got to share that allyship through a community and from a business awareness perspective.
Yeah, it's exactly that, how you act in the moment, isn't it? And that was clearly from the heart, and that's lovely. You said something about assumptions though, and Jules, I'm going to come to you. There's 2 things here. Assumptions are still being made, and therefore mistakes are being made, aren't they? So, you know, why do you think that's happening? Why aren't people just asking questions and being respectful?
I think asking questions or correcting yourself if you make a mistake is the best way to go, because the issue is that when you make an assumption, you know, you assume someone's partner is a he or she, or you assume someone's gender and someone's pronouns. The issue is that personally, it puts me in a position where it's like, oh, well, either I have to lie or I have to come out right then and there. And it's a bit of a difficult and tricky thing where it's like, oh, you know, is it, because I don't have time to think about it, oh, you know, how am I going to come out? Is it safe to do it? Is it going to be okay? And so it puts me in this difficult situation where it's like really awkward. And it's just like, oh, well, you know, do I just nod and smile and pretend nothing happened? And then, you know, potentially down the line, when I do come out, then it's going to be even more awkward, because it's going to be like, oh, well, you said, you know, you were a she and you're not. And then I do come out, and then I don't know what the repercussions are going to be. So it's a bit of a complicated situation. I think it's just so much easier to use gender neutral language, ask questions, and, you know, just not assume. And if people are, you know, not willing to answer those questions, that's fine. If you make a mistake, that's fine too. You can always correct yourself. And you know, I think, you know, being an ally is also knowing that you know, you're flawed and that you can make mistakes. And also correcting other people's mistakes, I think, is also a really good thing. Because if someone makes an assumption, it's a lot easier if there's an ally that's going to be there like, oh, actually, he's got a husband, or actually, she's got a wife, and not vice versa, rather than the person who is in this position having to correct the other person because saying, no, actually, I have a wife or a husband. It's easier if it's an ally that does it, because it gives more power to this, you know, correction. So yeah, I think it's just, you know, don't assume is probably the best way. ask questions and correct yourselves as you make a mistake.
There was a situation. Yes, go on, Saskia. Go on.
Sorry, I just wanted to add to that as well, because it's so true what Jules was saying there as well. And I think, as an inclusion trainer, often what I hear from people is that they'll either, shy away from those conversations or avoid them, so they do have the fear of maybe saying the wrong thing or offending someone. And I think also that goes back to the reason why we need to have more education and awareness. And people, it shouldn't obviously just be down to organisations to do it. We all have a responsibility to educate ourselves, but that's I think a call out to people to say, if you're not sure about certain LGBTQ+ identities and language, what that means, just do a bit of research. Google is your friend. You can get information very quickly. And thinking about the pronouns, if you're not sure what some of these pronouns are, just ask or say, introduce yourself with your pronouns. And because people often say, well, or assume, well, I only need to use pronouns if I'm talking to the trans community. No, we all have pronouns. So, your pronouns, use your pronouns, and that's how we'll start to break down those barriers around conversation, and obviously avoiding those awkward situations of misgendering a person, and putting someone, like how Jules said, putting them in that situation where they're like, oh, actually now I'm stuck. Do I have to come out? Do I lie? And it can totally avoid that. And it's simple tweaks, that can just make a massive difference. So, give your pronouns and ask, and you can avoid that completely.
And sometimes we're too polite though, aren't we? Someone's misgendered or made an assumption, and then, as you say, the moment's passed, then it's like, oh, well, it'll be rude if I go back now. And it's like, what? We shouldn't have to justify ourselves if that's our preference or, chosen language or whatever. So yeah, I think it's true. There's a situation we had recently. So a candidate had put their pronouns on their CV, and they, them, and I get it. The recruiters in Page were asking me, what should I do? But it's everything you just said. It's like, well, I can tell you what I think I would do, but if in doubt, ask the question yourself, because that candidate clearly has a reason they've done that, and they would want to be treated in the way they want to be treated, not in the way that I might be guessing that they want to be treated. And there's this desire to people feel like they have to know the answer all the time. And you don't, do you? You don't. It's ask the question. So a comment that's coming from the audience, it's also about learning listening skills. You sometimes have to come out multiple times during the same conversation when correcting somebody. Everybody, they say wife when I'm married to a man. Yeah, I guess you're all nodding, so you've all had experiences of that. I can tell. So then, how do we accelerate intersectionality with this? I touched on in the introduction about, we are more than just, well, you're more than any label, but, all too often people only seem to be able to cope with one diversity characteristic at a time. So how can we accelerate that a little bit? Tolu, can I come to you on that one? Then Jules, I'll get your view.
Yeah, happy to. I think the first thing for me is with intersectionality, which is everywhere. I think something that a lot of people don't necessarily acknowledge is that it isn't something that is brand new. That so for people who didn't know, it was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1988. So it's over 30 years ago, and I think it really helps contextualize how the multiple identities we have could lead to multiple layers of discrimination, but also privilege too. But she used, if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to listen to her TED Talk about it. And she uses the example of Black women and police brutality with the #SayHerName campaign. And as somebody who does cross over very many intersectionalities, so with myself, I'm Black, I'm a woman, I'm a lesbian, I'm British Nigerian. I was born in Nigeria and moved over to the UK when I was 5, so I'm an immigrant as well. So in many situations that you find yourself being, you often find people leading with one of your intersectionalities or identities and the way they speak to you. And that completely ignores so much of the rest of your identity, and almost sometimes silences or denies the whole person of who I am. And I often think sometimes there's this strange dynamic of I can be very visible, as sometimes when I think about work where I'm often the only Black person in the room or the black gay woman in the room. But sometimes you can be really invisible in conversations where people don't acknowledge your full intersectionality because people are like, oh, we don't, they're not even aware of that when they're talking to you. So I think there's definitely this real mix of how that comes across, and that can be really difficult. But I think that the main thing around accelerating something, which, as we all know, has been around for a long time, is just the real acknowledgement of it, and just having that awareness of it's a core part of the everyday, whether that's in the societal context of what we're doing and also in the workplace. And that means we can have much more nuanced conversations like we're having today about how we interact with each other in the context of workplace, in the workplace, or in the context of allyship. So I think a lot of points that have been highlighted around culture and being authentic, that if we are acknowledging intersectionality as part of that, it allows people to turn up as their authentic selves and speak up if they want to or if they don't want to. And it also allows people this idea of what their definition of professionalism is. Because I always say, like, professionalism, you don't have to compromise who you are to be professional. That you are a professional just by turning up as who you are. And I think also around representation in the workplace. So when we talk about representation, and I talk about it a lot, it's not just who you see maybe as your peers, it's who you see at senior leadership levels. As somebody who crosses many intersectionalities, it can be very disheartening when you look to the top and you don't see anyone like you there, that you almost have to be a bit of an optimist to be able to keep going in that way, and that can be very exhausting. And I think the final thing as well is when we're talking about intersectionality and we're seeing it as the everyday, that means we really weave it into the workplace in terms of the strategy and policies we use. And an example I often talk about is when we have conversations about the pay gap, we have it in such a binary way, and I find it super frustrating. Because when we talk about it, it's usually in the context of the binary terms of the impacts on men and women. But as a Black woman, there's also an ethnicity pay gap. So I'm actually double penalised in the conversation, and is any other ethnic minority woman. But we don't necessarily explore that kind of nuance. And also in terms of the data collection of it, we're talking about the binary terms of men and women. What about other genders? What about non-binary people? We don't even collect that data to even have the conversation. So those individuals are completely left out of it. So I think for me, we really need to be pushing towards that to be able to really accelerate intersectionality in the context of the workplace and beyond.
I think that's great. Jules, actually, that would be a really good point to bring you in on. How do you feel about some of the comments Tolu's made about the binary elements, gender pay gap, and so on?
Yeah, I think it's a really big problem, because obviously it erases non-binary people. They're not recognized legally in the UK, and there was a desire to have it recognized, and the government responded that it was too complicated. So unfortunately, non-binary isn't recognized in the UK. So there's a national scheme to collect gender pay gap data that is not going to recognize non-binary people, because it is still not recognized by the government that non-binary people are a thing. And the thing also is that, with these intersectionalities, is that obviously, there's this issue of race that Tolu brought forward, but as a trans person, there's also trans women and trans men who have a wider gender pay gap. And what's interesting is that I think what we can learn from trans people is how there is still a lot of sexism in our society, because with regards to the gender pay gap, trans men, after they transition, actually get a small pay increase, whilst trans women get a massive pay cut after they transition, which is further pay cut than the one that cis women have. And so it absolutely shows us that when trans women, when they were presenting as men, were paid the same way cis men were, but as soon as they start presenting as women, they don't get the same pay anymore. And so I think that tells us a lot, and that's something I bring forward a lot as well. When people say the gender pay gap doesn't exist, it's like, well, how do you explain that trans women get a pay cut when they transition?
Yeah.
And it's just, and I think, and that's something also that these intersections and looking at other intersections can help people in the majority as well. That's how looking at trans women can help strengthen the argument that cis women are discriminated against. And I think that's why allyship is so important as well, is that all of these intersectionalities if you look at the bigger picture, it helps everyone. And you know, for example, one thing that I'm working on currently at City is putting accommodations in place because I'm autistic and for neurodiverse people in general. And the idea is that, you know, we want people to be performing at their best. And neurodiversity is something that's extremely underdiagnosed. So we don't want people to necessarily have a piece of paper that says I have the diagnosis of ADHD or autism or dyslexia or whatever to be able to have those accommodations. We want it to be able to be like, oh, we have speech to text and text to speech software that's available for everyone. If you think that's something that's useful for you, just use it. And if you think you need accommodations to work and to be your, you know, to perform your best, then, you know, just ask. You don't need to have this piece of legislation. And I think, you know, that's something where we, you know, obviously it is coming from people who are neurodiverse or, you know, who are discriminated in some way, but it is helping everyone. And I think that's something that is, you know, really important when we think about it, is that, you know, there are people who are questioning, for example, in terms of LGBT, who are not going to come out, but they can still be helped by being asked this question and being, you know, knowing that when they do come out, it's going to be safe. And there are people who are thinking of transitioning and are going to, you know, realize that it is possible to transition at work, and that's something that's going to help them, even if eventually they decide not to transition, if that was just something that, you know, was a question that was there, but that, you know, didn't unfold. So, you know, it is a matter of not just helping the people who are discriminated against, but really it is something that is useful for other minorities as well.
Isn't there something that the Gen Zs are likely to change their gender more than once? I mean, this is only going to be more part of a necessary part of the culture, isn't it? And the openness and the willingness to support and allow people to truly be themselves. I was just going to come up on a point there about neurodiversity, because there's a real thing around many of the assistive technologies that help, whilst the point in allowing somebody who's neurodiverse to thrive, having that functionality within technology, it often is beneficial to neurotypical people as well. So it's almost a non-brainer. It's like, it isn't just a crucial part for this neurodivergent community. It's actually lots of people who can benefit from this. And it, you know, actually that kind of brings me on to policy quite nicely in a way, because Saskia, I'm going to come to you on this. When we talk about, and Ben, you can jump in with your professional hat on as well. So often there's a disconnect, isn't there? Because there might be policies that say this, and it's like, oh yes, we're all really nice and inclusive, and we've made sure we've changed our language and our policies. But the reality that then plays out in the workplace can often be very different. Saskia, can you perhaps talk about some of your experiences with this?
Yeah, I think, you know, in terms of where we are in policy and law, obviously thinking about the Equality Act 2010, you know, that is one of our, you know, our biggest inclusive policies tackling discrimination that we have. And I feel, you know, as well as there's lots of positive things that can come from that, there's still lots of changes that can be more inclusive, particularly, you know, with regards to the trans community and people who are identified as non-binary as well. But I think there are lots of positives. But I think, however, if you're worried, or if you're not being feel like you're not being supported, or you don't know what is in place in terms of a policy at work, always do your research, you know, because what your policy, as you just said, Sherry, you know, you may have a lovely fluffy policy that says we've got all this language now, but then the culture within that organisation is not reflecting what this policy says. So I think it's quite important to do your research, you know, so you legally know where you stand, versus even what a policy actually says. I mean, even if I just give an example for myself, when my sons have a mum and I were going through IVF, I'm the non-biological parent, and we were obviously looking into paternity leave and what that looked like for me as a parent, and where I stood legally with that. And actually, you know, it was a council at that point I was working. I'm talking over 12 years ago now, but it was a council I was working for, and they actually wasn't sure. You know, they had updated information around their traditional kind of policy, you know, for maternity and paternity leave for kind of heterosexual couples, but in terms of, you know, law for same-sex couples and parents, I was the one who had to do my research and tell them, you know, actually, well, legally what I'm entitled to actually, and this is what, you know, where I stand with that. And so I do think, you know, that it's important that just for your own peace of mind to make sure that you are, you know, you are up to date legally on where you stand. But again, for organisations themselves, it's a good reminder to double check your policies even now, you know, even for people maybe watching now. Have a look, like, where are you on trans inclusion? Where are you on, you know, within, you know, maternity and paternity on policy rights, because even for trans inclusion, you know, I've seen this a couple of times, that there'll be policies that are, you know, they're trans inclusive policy, and they talk a lot about trans women and support, but they don't actually have enough or much support around trans men and you know, the transition and what support is available, you know, for even thinking about top surgery. You know, so it's, again, I think is a good reminder for people to think, actually, let's refresh or look at where we're at with our policy and make sure, if we're not up to date, you know, what can we do to make sure we are being as inclusive, and, you know, considering intersectionality as well. Where are we at with that now, and what improvements can we, you know, can we make? And I think a good way to do that as well, just to add, isn't always just about, well, the legal side, of course, important, but talk to your employees. You know, staff surveys are really good to see how people feel about these things and what their needs are, to help, you know, build that picture of actually where a true figure or true reflection of where we are actually at as an organisation, and what actually we may have missed, what we may need to add, and what changes we can make. So yeah, research is always a good one on both sides.
And I always bang the drum around menopause. Everyone's like, oh, you need to put it on the women's group. I'm like, well, what about trans men? Or, you know, it's not only a women. Anyway, that's a separate conversation. Ben, what's your kind of input on the whole policy and inclusive versus inclusive culture piece?
I suppose it comes down to the conundrum, doesn't it, that organisations have policies, and what do? Probably sit on the back burner to not really do a lot. Certainly for me, and just picking up on those points from Saskia, is around that enrolment. So example being in organisations where we've simplified policies, not only from a language, look and feel perspective, but being really clear around what is advice and guidance and what is prescriptive legal practice, because as organisations, you can't hide from the legal ramifications if you get something wrong. And equally for me, it just removes some of the scaremongering that can often happen within an organisation. Often HR policies are written in a language that is so legalistic that it actually intimidates the reader. So you've got to roll that right the way back through. And in doing that, it's around getting input from the various network groups that organisations have, because they play a real pivotal and critical role in bringing feedback through from a language, look and feel, from an inclusivity perspective, and making sure that we're not excluding individuals by writing things in silos. And where we can signpost and provide additional information, because often as organisations, we are never going to be the experts around everything and anything, but we have a legitimate requirement to make sure that we are providing the support, guidance and signposting for people to self-serve additional information as you go through. And then the third point is around creating that feedback loop. So usability of policies from colleagues, from managers, from think tanks that are coming through, because they have to be a living being in an organisation, not these horrible, hard, black and white beige things that sit on an intranet site and don't really deliver any value. And equally, the cultural piece there is 100% accurate, because culture is not just something that we shove up on a website or you go through a recruitment practice. You know, we're all intelligent human beings. If we've been missold a culture on entering an organisation because it looks completely different from what we were sold on the tin, then people are not going to stay. So it needs to be real. For HR professionals on the call, I would say this is where we can play a real vital lead in making that difference for organisations. We need to put that human factor back in. We need to be out there enrolling and engaging with people in our business to really make policy artifacts and information that we deliver out to our colleagues in an organisation real, tangible and informative. So yeah, it's always a mission, but equally in the profession, it's a huge bugbear as well. Why have something that people can't use, read, understand and apply? Roll it back, take the time, do something a little bit different, and you'll make a real difference for the business that you work in. Yeah,
often it is those sort of subtle changes, isn't it? It doesn't necessarily always need to be grand gestures. Saskia, do you want to come in again? Yeah.
Something that I meant to add to exactly everything that Ben just said there as well, but also, you know, when you talk about the black and white, the dark, kind of, you know, describing how those policies are often set, you have to also bear in mind people's learning style as well. And it is a really good practice if you can have that in various different versions, like even audio as opposed to a paper copy, you know, or even a video of what this is talking about. You know, you could really make a difference to that person's you know, viewing experience and understanding, because again, you know, this is where it will negatively impact people think, well, actually, I'll just forget about it. It's not worth it. And they're probably, particularly if they're those people who already are experiencing homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, or being discriminated against, you know, you can imagine the impact on their mental health as it is around stress, anxiety and depression. And then they've got to go through, trudging through all this legal jargon. They're like, you know, so think about, again, making it user-friendly and different forms of how that can, you know, the learning style of how that person may want to read that. Make a difference.
Jules, big support of you there, Saskia, as well, giving you a thumbs up for that, so thank you. Question from the audience: same-sex relationships are not always very accepted in different cultures. How has this experience been for those from different cultural backgrounds? Sean, do you fancy taking that one?
Yes. So I actually come from an interracial and intergenerational relationship. So my husband is 60 and I'm 32. We've been together for 12 years. And it's actually very different in Singapore, where the optics of our relationship are very much sort of skewed to one way. And, you know, to a certain extent, I'm being sort of discriminated by sort of my own sort of ethnic sort of background people, because when we go to restaurants, often not, he's addressed as sir, and I'm sort of always the other person. The person stands to open the door for him, but, you know, so I've got to open the door myself. He gets the bill and I don't. So sometimes that the sort of experience can be quite jarring. And you know, it does sort of, you tell yourself, you know, water off a duck's back, right? But it does sort of stay on your mind for a bit. And, you know, even after all these years, it doesn't become easier. And sometimes, you know, I think of a way of how should I best sort of approach the situation. I mean, more often than not, my husband tends to be the one that addresses the situation, but sometimes I have to sort of admit I get a bit passive aggressive and so, oh, by the way, I'm the one that's paying for this meal. I'm the one that ordered the wine and it's going to be tasting for the wine,
Yeah.
right? So I think you shouldn't be sort of like afraid to sort of, you know, you don't have to be sort of like outrightly sort of, I guess, aggressive, but in a certain way, just sort of assert that, you know what, that I'm not always just the other person, even though I'm the younger person in a relationship, I'm the Asian person in a relationship, right? So definitely that's my experience from being in sort of like an interracial and sort of intergenerational sort of relationship with my husband.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to, Tolu? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So my background, I come from a British Nigerian, and the experience of coming out was difficult, to put it lightly. That my family were also very Christian, so there's a lot of homophobia and misunderstandings thrown into that experience, and also the culture of being from Nigeria, where there are many laws around criminalization of LGBTQ+ people, and also at the moment a same-sex marriage carries a prison term of 14 years in Nigeria. So the climate is very hostile, and I think for me that has been a really difficult experience of a lot of rejection from people culturally, but also from your family themselves. But I think I've definitely been on a journey around understanding and unlearning a lot of the misunderstandings around our culture being homophobic. So for example, a lot of those laws are word for word laws, which carry a post-colonial hangover of, these are laws that we now have struck down in the UK, but pretty much still word for word exist in Nigeria. So I know for me, there's an element of knowing that is the truth behind it, rather than the homophobia that you're kind of met with. And also from a cultural understanding, kind of exploring my heritage more and understanding that there are LGBTQ+ people that existed before colonialism, before any of those things happened, and people live their lives in that way. But so you know that you are not somebody who is unusual by being a Nigerian, a lesbian, and all those identities. Actually, you are just as able to embrace that culture and really understand yourself. But I think it takes a lot. So when you are from a different cultural background, there's probably a lot of unlearning to do, because you've had that kind of pushed in front of you and made you to feel that way. But a lot of that is certainly from my experiences, misunderstanding, and also just the hangover of colonialism.
Yeah, I think unlearning is the key word there. I think that applies to everybody. That, you know, we've had so many societal inputs, haven't we? There's a couple more questions here, and I'm going to ask you for quick takeaways. So short answers, please, from here on. How can you engage a whole community where it is seemingly divided? Jules, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think the division that kind of sometimes exists between the trans and the like more LGB community is not historical. It's completely ahistorical because originally everything was about gender. It was about gay men looking more feminine, lesbians being more butch, and trans women and trans men also playing with gender. And so, you know, I think that, you know, if you look historically at the Stonewall riots or at, you know, anything that was happening in the 50s and the 60s, even before that in the 20s in Germany, there was this trans community that existed that was part of the same umbrella. And so this division has been fabricated just for the purpose of rolling back first trans rights, but obviously later on LGBT rights are also going to be rolled back in the same movement. And we're seeing it in the US with Roe v. Wade being overturned, with, you know, don't say gay bills. It's all part of the same kind of conservative backlash.
I watched the Janes last night. I was in tears. So there's another question here, but it ties in with what I was going to ask you all to wrap up with anyway, because we're at time. Question here is, where would you suggest would be a good starting point in implementing inclusion within the organisation? So just think about that for a second, because I'll come to you, Saskia, first. Yeah, let's tie this in with final takeaways. So if you can try and flip this into your one step, a bold step, if you want, you know, really go out there, but basically your one takeaway, which is going to be really key for helping implementing inclusion. Saskia, take it away.
To be honest, that would have been my takeaway for people, because for many organisations, they will see it as a bold step, even though it shouldn't be. I would always say, yeah, absolutely make sure that you have mandatory, not you know, it's mandatory training, I think, is the key here, and making sure that that is available. So I would always say make sure you've got mandatory inclusion training, which I will add, you can check out my website, saskia.co.uk, and my everyday training. But I would always say training, because if we don't have education awareness, how can we ever think to move forward?
Well said. Well said. Check out Saskia's website, everybody. We can, you know, send that out to you. Ben.
Well, I'm going to be radical, and I'm going to say inclusion starts with yourself. So you need the confidence and commitment for yourself. So we're all unique, irrespective of characteristics and what communities we come in. So being proud of yourself, challenging the status quo, and starting a momentum. But you need that wholesome, honest conversation around what does this need to look and feel like for me, and how can I support and champion that and get a movement.
Lovely. Thank you. Jules.
What I'm going to suggest is reverse mentoring. That's something that City has been doing recently, and it's a junior kind of marginalized person who is mentoring a more senior person who is not marginalized in that way. And it's been extremely helpful. It's helped build relationships and understanding, and people feel more confident to support the LGBT community. They feel like, you know, they're not going to make those horrible mistakes, and if they do, it's okay, and they can correct themselves. And it's really had a positive impact. So yeah, reverse mentoring.
Yeah, big fan of reverse mentoring. Thanks, Jules. Sean?
For me, I think from an individual contributor perspective, you know, don't always sort of think that it's always about the big wins. Going back to Ben's points, right? It starts with the small wins, because the small wins culminate into the big wins. And I think for HR professionals or for managers, don't assume that your employees always know what policies you have in place, right? Verbalize it. Don't be afraid to share it. Speak it out and share it with employees. And I think when it's being brought to life versus sort of in some hidden PDF document within your drive, it really helps as a starting point towards inclusion.
Nice, thank you, Sean. And Tolu, wrap it up for us.
So for me, it's very much about representation at senior leadership levels, at decision-making levels, so that we can ask ourselves the questions that when we are making policy around recruitment, promotion, retention, all those policies, that do we have, for example, LGBTQ plus voices in the room who are part of that decision-making process? Do we have those people who are doing that, or are we just going out and making decisions that will impact the entirety of that particularly marginalized people and not including them in the conversation?
bankers, isn't it? Lovely. You have been an absolute treasure, all 5 of you. Jules, Ben, Saskia, Tolu and Sean. Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining today. Enjoy the rest of your day.
If you found this video helpful for your recruitment journey, why not subscribe to our channel? And don't forget to tap the bell to get the latest videos first.